Welcome back to the Scholar Advising Podcast. Today we're talking about the kinds of financial decisions that come up during big life transitions, divorce, inheritance, and finally getting to that moment where your student loans are gone. We'll walk through how to think about dividing assets, what to do with inherited brokerage accounts, and how to reset your plan when you're starting fresh. And in this week's Myth or Money, we're tackling a common belief: I don't need to start planning for retirement yet. So let's get into question one.
I'm a divorce attorney and listen to the show so I can more effectively advise my clients who are trying to minimize the impact on their wealth moving forward. North Carolina law tends to treat the value of all assets equally. So if a court is to divide up assets and a lawyer doesn't make strong arguments about this issue, there tends to be no real difference between, say, $1 million in real estate, cash, certificate of deposits, 401k, etc. However, in terms of present value, those different types of assets vary wildly, even if their quote on sticker amount is identical. So my question is, if I have clients who are still years away from retirement and are seeking to divide up the marital estate, what kinds of assets are preferable and which ones should I avoid if I'm trying to maximize both short-term and long-term value?
Huge question, and one that's really actually interesting to get into because it gets a little bit more into the theory side of how finance is done and how you think about money, especially money now versus money later, pre-tax and post-tax issues. So we can unpack a few of these, but I'm really glad that you're looking at all of this for your clients, because many times we'll look at divorce settlement agreements and it is exactly what you described. It's someone is getting a retirement account in the house and then someone else is getting a pile of cash, and they're treated as equals, and that's so far from the truth in those cases. So let's first talk about this idea of present values and future values. So for those who have never taken a introductory finance course in college, or if you slept through that course, there's a concept of present values and future values called the time value of money. And the idea is that a dollar today is worth more than a dollar 10 years from now. The concept is really easy. If I were to give you $1 million today, and I give you the option of saying, I'll give you $1 million in cash today, or I can give you the same $1 million 10 years from now, everyone takes the $1 million today because it doesn't make sense to wait for 10 years. There's lots of reasons for that. There's risk issues for waiting for the 10 years, and I might not be around, you might not be able to find me, right? So there's counterparty risk in those scenarios. There's risks associated with inflation concerns. There's opportunity cost of what you could do with the $1 million today and invest it. It would be worth more than the $1 million 10 years from now. So that concept doesn't go away. It's a key focus in financial theory and a lot of things that we deal with. And in your situation, when you're dealing with a client and they're in a scenario, I see this commonly with alimony payouts. So you see a scenario where you have a string of payments that go out 10, 15 years. And what will commonly happen is I'll see an attorney take all that, aggregate it, and just say, well, the total of all these payments is $1 million. And then you look and say, well, it's not really $1 million because the first check that you received today is worth a lot more than that check received 10 years from now or 15 years from now. It's not really worth anything. So what you should be doing is taking the present value of all of those future cash flows, discounting them all today, and then adding it up. That's the easiest way to handle this concept of money now versus money later. And that's only one piece of this. The other one that I look at is the pre-tax versus after-tax concern. Receiving a retirement account that is pre-tax, maybe like a traditional IRA or a 401k that's all tax deferred, is much more problematic than receiving a Roth account or a brokerage account that's just in cash or has capital gains. That absolutely has to be taken into account. And you take the amount of money that's in the traditional IRA that's tax deferred and multiply it by 1 minus a tax rate that you think is effective. And that would give you a rough estimate of what the post-tax value of that account is. Now, the other issue that comes in, and this also starts to affect the real estate discussion as well, as this illiquidity issue of I may still receive a traditional IRA, and maybe it has some tax discount on it and everything else. But the other problem is I can't touch it till 59 and a half without a penalty at least. So now we have this liquidity issue that in a settlement, you can end up receiving a amount of money that can't be touched for decades, or has tax implications associated with it, or would be very difficult to sell. And imagine a situation where you see these scenarios of somebody's going to get a collection of assets that they've had, or real estate, things that are not necessarily easy to get rid of. There should be an illiquidity discount put on those. Now that is really difficult to calculate, and sometimes it's easier. Real estate tends to be a little easier on the illiquidity discount. And the idea here is that if an asset is easier to sell and it's closer to cash, then it's worth more like cash. In other words, if I give you $100,000 in a savings account, that's $100,000 real-time cash to me today. If I give you $100,000 of a stamp collection, that's not really going to be $100,000 to you today. So you have to go look at that collection and say, what is the value of those assets that you could actually get if you were to sell them? And how long is it going to take you to sell all those things? How much time and effort are you going to have to hire a broker? You have to pay fees. And that's where real estate tends to come in. I see that regularly where it's saying, sure, I'm going to receive a $500,000 piece of real estate, but it's going to cost at least 10% in fees for me to get out of this. So that's $50,000. Plus, it may take a year or two for me to get out of it, depending on the type of real estate that's there. So it's not worth $500,000. It may be at best it's worth $450,000, and when you take into account the time value of money components, it's really worth maybe $400,000, if not worse. So those are big, and capital gains falls into that as well. It's a similar idea to that tax issue of what the issue would be if I receive $1 million of appreciated stock that has a ton of gains in it. And now if I try to sell it, I'm going to have all these tax implications. That needs to be taken in. I think you have a good shot. In other words, of your situation, I think you're thinking about it the right way, of looking at it from your client's perspective of it's not cash over here and cash over there are not equal. And because of all these factors, whether it's tax, whether it's illiquidity issues, whether it's present value concerns. But fortunately, this is not a foreign concept. It should be relatively easy, hopefully, depending on the judge and their financial knowledge there, of breaking this down to say, these are well-researched and commonly used processes to find the present value of assets. And I think you can make a pretty compelling case when you take into account liquidity, tax, and the ability to look at all this on a present value terms. But bringing everything to present value is going to be huge when you're going through all of these different concerns. Great question. And on to our second question.
My husband and I are both physicians in our late 30s. We just finished paying off our student loans, and we're both earning in the mid 300Ks. We have a pretty big mortgage, and honestly, we haven't built much of a financial plan beyond pay off the debt. Now that we're past that, what should we be thinking about next?
Very cool. This is fantastic for you. The paying off the debt is a huge milestone. You need to make sure you're celebrating that. I think it's the big thing. It's really easy to do exactly what you're doing right now and say, all right, well, we paid off all these loans. Now what's next? We're behind. And forget to be happy about the fact that you just accomplished a major financial goal. So the overarching theme of your financial life for the next 5 to 10 years is going to be this shift from debt reduction into wealth building. Now, depending on what your payments were, it doesn't necessarily mean that every single dollar that was going to debt reduction needs to now go into building up wealth, but a large chunk of it likely will be, especially for the next 5 or 10 years. Always better to start off saving early than it is to wait and you already have a delay, and that's not uncommon. The physician path for retirement saving tends to be delayed because of the time in school, because of the debt. So you're not in an uncommon situation, but I also don't want you to get into the common situation of what happens next is saying, well, we paid off all this debt, so it's time to treat ourselves with new cars, new house, and you continue to build up all of these other things that are not actually saving for retirement. I'm not saying you can't do any of that stuff. I'm saying that you really need to balance that out. So starting to think back, and before you do anything else, just thinking about what does a plan look like? How much do you need to be saving? You're likely going to be maxing out tax advantage accounts, your 403b, 401ks from work, 457s, that kind of thing. You're likely already doing that. If you're not, you should be. Take advantage of any matching there, maxing those out. And then really what ends up happening is the plug account, so to speak, is going to be your brokerage account. You're going to have all of these things maxed out. You're going to be doing your backdoor Roths, do your 403bs, your 401ks, all of that's maxed. And then you're going to have excess cash. The problem with the brokerage account with excess cash is there's no limit. So it's easy to look at an IRA and say, well, there's $7,000 limit, so I max that out. I'm great, right? You go to a 401k and you hit the max there. But the brokerage account has no limit. So it's this open-ended goal, which is frankly a horrible goal because it's not measurable. So you're always going to end up feeling like you're behind if you're constantly just saving into this empty void that is a brokerage account. So you need to establish a dollar amount that is your goal to save to that brokerage account every single year. Once that amount is determined, then you're going to open up a whole new level of flexibility for yourself. Because what's going to happen is, let's say you have the goal of $50,000. After maxing everything else out, you need $50,000 that needs to go into the brokerage account. So you put $50,000 in there, and now you have a bonus comes in and you have an extra $20,000 or $30,000. It's going to be really easy just to say, I'm going to throw that into the brokerage account. That's not necessarily a bad idea, but the trap that puts you in is kind of the opposite of lifestyle creep. You end up getting the savings creep aspect that goes on, where you're constantly adding to the brokerage, always feeling like you're behind. And then when it comes time to be able to enjoy spending some of that money, whether it is on, maybe you decide to buy a vacation home, or you decide to buy a new car, take a vacation, you're looking at that brokerage account and say, well, I don't know how much I can take out of that account because you've constantly been adding to it. So my recommendation is always to go through and try to open up 2 brokerage accounts. I would do one for long-term retirement savings type brokerage to put that 50 or whatever it is in, and then the other brokerage account to be used a little bit more like savings, kind of a beefed up savings account for things like renovations, vacations, anything like that tend to come up. And then if that account starts to get too big, of course, you could always move that money into, we'll call it the boring retirement account, and be able to use it that way. Common things that tend to come up with that excess account is paying down the mortgage or paying off the mortgage if you haven't already done so, especially depending on the rate that you have. You're going to be in a higher tax bracket, so there are some huge advantages there of writing off the interest. But I've never heard anyone complain after they've paid off their mortgages that I really wish I wouldn't have done that. It tends to be an easy one, especially after you've hit that initial goal of saving for in your brokerage. If you hit that goal, but again, where you use that $50,000 mark and you say, I'm putting $50,000 into this brokerage account for retirement savings. If you end up with another 50 in the other brokerage account and you don't have any vacation plans or you don't have anything like that, or you just say, let's go drop $50,000 in the mortgage, that's a great spot to be in, despite the fact that it may not be the textbook answer of whether or not you should pay off the mortgage. There's a huge advantages there as well. So constantly adjusting that as your wealth continues to build. Really got to watch risk management, estate planning. Some of the more boring stuff is going to start rolling in here on insurances, umbrella policies, all of that. Those are really factors that are going to come up in the next 5 to 10 years. You have the classic avoid the lifestyle creep issues that are going to come in with this as well, now that you have more money hitting your accounts. But based on the fact that you've already hit such a major financial goal, and your worry is not what car to buy next, or your worry is how do we immediately shift from paying off our loans to building up as much wealth. I don't think lifestyle creep is going to be as much of an issue for you. I think it's probably going to do the opposite, which is common with a lot of clients that we work with, and I've worked with that, is that you do such a good job saving that you get to this point of having these massive accounts. You say, well, what do I do with them? And it becomes harder, believe it or not, to spend that money than it is to save even more, because you already have such a great financial habit of saving money. So don't forget to enjoy some of it as well, especially once you've established those goals of savings and have accomplished them. And now we can roll into our final question of the day.
I just inherited a taxable brokerage account from my late father. It's worth about $1.2 million, mostly in individual stocks he held for decades. I've read about the step up in basis, but I'm not totally clear on how that works or what I should be thinking about now. Should I just leave the account as is or start making changes?
Yeah, good question. I have to laugh because it's always the father who has all the individual stocks. And it's never I inherited an account from my mother and she had a bunch of individual stocks. I never get it. But dad's always had these large individual stock portfolios that we end up with. The fortunate thing is the step up in basis is really simple. Imagine having an account where you have a $100,000 position and it grows to $1 million. Now you have $900,000 in gains that if you tried to sell that $1 million, you'd have to pay tax on that $900,000. Step up in basis says that now that you've inherited that account, the cost on that account is no longer $100,000. It is $1 million. So it eliminates all of those capital gains, or at least most of those capital gains, up until, depending on how long you've had the account, things can move around. So the huge advantage there is it allows you to sell out of all those individual stocks without having to pay capital gains tax on that step up, on the jump in cost basis from what your father purchased them for compared to what you inherited them at. So the advantage there allows you to diversify easily without the big tax hit. What I don't want you to do is just to sit there and wait. It's really common for people to look at the account and say, well, I'm not sure what to do with it, so I'll just keep it in whatever mom and dad hadn't invested in it. And now the account continues to grow, and then you go to sell, and while you did get a step up on some of it, let's say from the 100,000 to the million, now the account's worth 1.5. That additional $500,000 is now your gain to keep and to pay tax on. So you want to be careful of that, where the stock prices are going now. Generally, as soon as you inherit the account, unless you really love those individual stocks, which I would recommend, I would drop those out of the account, sell it. Worst case, it goes into cash right now. And as long as you're at a good broker that has good options for some cash sweep positions, some good money market options, you have time to deal with how it should be invested, what concerns you should have when it comes to risk tolerance and how it's going to affect your own personal portfolio. But that decision doesn't have to be made before you sell. Sell first, take the advantage of the step up. You have all the cash. I'd much rather you be sitting in $1.2 million of cash and waiting to come up with a plan to invest it than sitting in $1.2 billion of individual stocks that are gaining a bunch of tax issues. All right, and now it's time for our rotating special segment. This week, it's Myth or Money, where we take on a common belief about personal finance and unpack whether it really holds up. This week's myth, actually related to our second question, it comes straight from conversations with clients trying to teach their kids good money habits. The pushback was, I'm too young to start worrying about retirement. So we're going to talk a little bit about why that thinking can be costly and what early planning actually gives them. The key here is that it's not uncommon. This is a really common pushback that we see, where we have parents are super excited to give their kids financial plans. And they're like, Stephan, can you come up with a financial plan for them? They're freshmen in college, let's jump into it. And sometimes it works great. They're really motivated about finance. They're interested in it. So you some book recommendations, you talk to the investors, and they're on it, right? They're building portfolios. They're thinking long-term. They're a 20-year-old thinking like a 70-year-old about their investments. Fantastic. But commonly what happens is they push back and say, I don't need to worry about a financial plan right now. In my 20s or in my early 30s, I don't have to worry. I'm too young to start worrying about retirement. That's later on down the road. And the problem is that going back to, actually, this is a great one to mix in because it mixes in a couple of the different topics we've already talked about. That we have this time value money aspect from the very first question we were talking about today. And that if you have the time value money factor, money should double roughly every 10 years in the stock market. Rule of 72 is what's called. So you take 72 divided by the rate of return you'd expect, and that gives you the number of years roughly to double your money if you didn't add anything to it. So you take 72, you divide it by roughly 7% return in the stock market, 10 years to double your money. So what people miss out on is they say, in my 20s, I don't want to invest in anything because I don't really have too much to invest anyways. What ends up happening though is any money you're investing in your 20s is going to double by the time you're in your 30s. It's going to double again by the time you're 40, double again time you're 50, double again your time you're 60, double again time you're 70. So you have all of these different doublings that are happening. So that's where you start to get these large exponential growth, because you're going from 10,000 to 20,000 to 40,000 to 80,000 to 160, right? And we're moving up from there up into the 300s, you get up to 320. That's huge when you think about that's only one $10,000 investment in your 20s. And that's not too far off from a Roth contribution of $7,000. If they're doing that every single year, they could save aggressively, or even just save in general. Even if you don't want to push the aggressive aspect on them to save a lot, right? Just if they save a little bit in their 20s for 10 years, to 20 to 30, even into their early 30s, that 15 years of saving is going to be significantly better for them and worth significantly more than them waiting until 50 to get from 50 to 65. And you have to save a lot more at 50 to 65 than you do at 20 to 35 to be able to get to the same point in retirement. In fact, I'd argue that probably back it up with the math. We had a spreadsheet going in front of us here, but to be able to do that, that 15 years, my guess is you would never get to the point of the 15 years from 20 to 35 is going to put you at a point that seems so high, so much higher than anywhere from 50 to 65, that the savings amount needed from 50 to 65 to get to the same point would almost be impossible on assuming a normal salary run that we'd be dealing with. So it's never too young to start worrying about retirement. I think that might be the common issue is parents typically are looking at this saying, we're looking at this from a retirement perspective. We're worried about retirement, so we want our kids to be able to retire. Because if we only knew in our 20s, we should save X. The problem is that kids have no interest in retirement, but money they have an interest in. So they probably are too young to start worrying about retirement. They're not too young to start worrying about money. And maybe framing it that way helps that out. But that idea of how much time, the time value of money, and doing a quick Google search for a compound interest chart is massive to show what ends up happening to money 10, 20, 30 years down the road. So it's never too early to start those conversations. It just may be how they're framed that can convince or can push back on some of the pushback related to being too young. And that's it for our show this week. We'll see you next week. Hey, this is Stephan. Thanks for tuning in to the Scholar Advising Podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to tackle in a future episode, share with us at scholarfinancialadvising.com/podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time.
Scholar Advising is an independent, fee-only financial advisory firm focused on providing hourly financial advice. The information provided in this podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only, and is not intended to constitute financial, investment, or other professional advice. The opinions expressed are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of any affiliated organizations. Investing in financial markets involves risk, including the potential loss of principal. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Before making any investment decisions, you should consult with a qualified financial advisor who can assess your financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance. Thanks for listening.